Hi, in this video I'm going to talk to you about the changes for TilePlus Toolkit for version 4. There's some various upgrades. The Toolkit underlying code and TilePlus Painter has some upgrades. I'm not going to really talk about them very much. It's mostly performance improvements and bug fixes. If you want the entire details, you can read the changelog. If you go to TilePlus Extras, documentation folder, you can see there's a What's New in 4 document. New layout system, which is what we're going to talk about today, and upgraded API references and other documentation. If you're new to the system, really suggest that you read the User Guide 4.0, followed by the Programmer's Guide, and advanced TileFab use. Otherwise, details of the layout system probably won't make a lot of sense. So what this video is mostly going to talk about is the new layout system. So what's a layout system? If you have a tile map that's really large, you probably want to, and your character is moving around this large tile map, you may want to consider streaming or chunking it in and out as your character moves around, and that's what this does. And really, what you have as a manager for a grid and its tile maps, you can have more than one grid. That corresponds, if you look at the game controller, to a TP zone layout for each managed grid. Okay. Zone layouts are things that are talked about pretty extensively in the older documentation. They're really just the layout engine. The big difference is that in this new version, they're async. You can use either Unity's version of async or you can use C#. There's information about how to do that in the documentation. The important feature in here is a thing called the Chunked Scene Manager, which lets you have a list of scenes, which you can edit. Scenes can be launched from their GUID, their name, or their order in this list. Doesn't really make a difference. The GUID is to be preferred because it can't be changed. You can't edit it on here. It's not editable, but you can copy it if you want to. Then each scene has the specs for the layout, and when you call the underlying code in the scene manager to load a new scene, it will poke the values and overrides from here into the appropriate zone layout with the same name. You notice there's a layout name, those have to match. And the reason is that this scene list is a project asset, and this is in the scene, so you can't have a direct link. So it has to be done by name. Padding, throttle delays, these are discussed in the documentation. The delays are a way to spread out the loading of tile fabs over time, and padding ensures that adding and deleting tiles which are outside of the camera view happens even further outside the camera view, so there's no chance of any visual artifacts, which can happen if your character is moving around. So you have to actually play around with these different values to get them to work properly for your application, but it's very flexible. And you can do all these overrides on a scene-by-scene basis. So let me show you how this works. Just to make it easier, I just want to make sure the overrides are off. We don't want to have slow. So let's run the game. And you'll see here, this is just a section of the entire design scene. I'll show you that design scene later. But you'll see as we move around, a little bug guy here. In edit mode, the system draws some boxes temporarily around the areas just as a visual guide for what's happening. And you can see areas being loaded and unloaded. This here is a prefab. This was part of the original design scene. That gets loaded and unloaded as the scenes move around. That's automatic. This here is a treasure chest tile, which when you go over it, it disappears, and it also had spawned out a prefab, and this is a waypoint. And I mention this just to show that state is saved when you start. Comes right back, and you'll notice our little treasure chest is correctly not there. There's a lot of other features you can read about and play with. One interesting thing is the way this demo works, and it's not really a part of the layout system. Oh, it's easy enough to do, is these NPCs, which are spawned out of various buildings in this scene, if they move out of the original zone, those little boxed in areas that you saw drawn in here, they won't get deleted until that new zone is deleted from the tile map. In other words, if you have prefabs that are spawned using this system and they happen to be NPCs and they move around away from the original area where they were located, they won't get deleted when the original area was, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of other details to this that you could read about. I'll just show one other interesting thing, and then I'll talk about how to set up a scene for this system. Is you can go, a waypoint can just be a waypoint, or it can load a new level. This is purely a feature of this scene. You don't have to use waypoints, but this illustrates what happens when you go to a new level. This is also kind of interesting because this outline here is a rule tile, and you'll see it reformatting as chunks move in and out. It's just pretty neat. And you go back. So it's a system where you could theoretically have just one scene for your entire game and just load in new tile scenes, or you could have one gigantic tile map. So now I'll show you how you actually can create the assets required for the tile scene. So I'll pop up, this is a design scene. We'll unload the demo scene just to make the scene a little cleaner. Okay, so this is our original scene, and you'll notice actually both scenes are in this same Unity scene, which is not used for anything other than a design. You don't really have to do it that way. Important thing, the area that you want to use has to be square, and it has to be a power of 2, and the sides have to be, which means in effect that the sides have to be of an even value, like 64. So you can have this area here happens to be 64 by 64, but it could be, 8192 by 8192. It's whatever you want, subject to memory, because it does use memory to cache and load an entire tile scene when you can have tens of thousands of tiles. But let's see how this works. So the easiest way to archive this is you use the bundling system, which is Tools, TilePlus, Prefabs, Bundled Tile Maps. But you need a grid selection. So we'll use TilePlus Painter merely because it's easy. You need to select a tile map that's within the grid you want to use, because that determines the layout, or the grid layout. If you look at the grid component, part of what it does is determine the layout parameters of the tile map. So you just pick any of them, and then we go into grid selection mode. Happens to be already a grid selection that I created that's 64 by 64. We'll do the grid selection. You'll see we have a grid selection, and it's appeared there. So we'll say create tile fab. Continue. We'll just create a new folder. We don't want to create a prefab. Generally, you don't want to in general with tile fabs, because prefabs don't really make sense, but the capability is there anyway. But definitely want to bundle child prefabs because we have some, those little flickering things on the garbage cans actually. They're like Gurney garbage cans. You can enter a name. We'll call this test, just for fun. So the generated assets be available in TilePlus Painter. TilePlus Painter can actually paint tile fabs and tile bundles, which lets you paint multiple tile maps at the same time. These you don't really want them to be available in Painter. That's a flag bit on the assets. You can always change it later, but if you don't need it to show up there, just say no, and you probably don't. So we bundled almost 9,000 tiles and 2 prefabs. Continue. So let's take a look at what we have here. Go back to the folder, and you'll see we have all the bundles. The Interact bundle is the one that has all the TilePlus tiles on it. It's not required to have them on one. That's just my convention. These are locked assets, which is something you can read about what locked means. This is the chest, treasure chest tile. It's really just a slideshow or an animation, really. Spawners and so on, they're all there. So the other thing you need to get this to work is the selector, which is the asset that tells the system what to do with all these bundles and tile fabs. The create TilePlus chunk zone selector. We could name it something else if you want. We drag in the tile fab source. We set this to Chunkify default. You have to really get none first, or it gives you mixed, some things that you don't want. That's it. Then if you wanted to, you would just drag this into one of these selector positions, and you would use that. And actually, this level 0 selector, which is all the way down here in tile scene 0, is essentially the same thing as we just created. As a matter of fact, it's going to be exactly the same, other than its GUID is going to be different. So the last thing I would like to talk about before ending this video is what are initializers. You'll notice if we look at, get rid of the, load the actual game, get rid of the design scene again, and let's look at the game controller one more time. If we look at the zone layout, you'll see it has a default initializer. So what do the initializers do? Many times when you're loading a level, whether or not it's tile maps or not, when you load the level, you have to maybe examine some data about the level to figure out what to do with it. Like, for example, where waypoints are. So as this game, using this game as an example, both of the 2 tile scenes have waypoints. So the default initializer is doing something that's done in every level in this example, which is extract all the waypoints and put them in a file somewhere, that's rather into a data structure somewhere that lets us figure out, what the last waypoint was. If there's a save file, it lets us determine where to place the player initially, and a lot of other things. You can read about this, how this works in the code. There's an awful lot of comments. But you might also want to have a override initializer, or one that augments what the default one does. So you can create another initializer, put it in there, and there's a flag bit you can set to say whether it adds functionality to what's done in the default or substitutes for it completely. So it's a really flexible way of kind of refactoring a lot of boilerplate code related to setting the system up after you've loaded a level. It works really nicely. Doesn't do everything you need to do, but it does most of it. So if there's a hue and cry, I can do a video doing a code walk through the game controller and how it all works. But that's it for today.